Okay, when Burke Ramsey said he was moving on, let's take a moment to really lay out what we've been circling around, because the details here are tied not just to words, but to how those words were framed and understood. At the center of this is Burke Ramsey, the 9-year-old brother of JonBenet, and the way he presented himself in interviews shortly after her death. Then we have figures like John and Patsy Ramsey, who described him as fragile and unable to face the situation. And on the other side, you have investigators, psychologists, and later media figures like Dr. Phil and the CBS documentary team, all trying to make sense of his demeanor. The key focus for us has been this phrase Burke used in a 1997 interview, "I'm just going on with my life," and how that short statement has been dissected, defended, and criticized ever since. What's interesting here is that Burke himself didn't even remember saying it years later until Dr. Phil showed him the clip. And then instead of rethinking it, he doubled down, calling it part of his reserved personality. Meanwhile, pseudo experts like Laura Richards pointed out how odd it sounded for a 9-year-old, especially in the middle of what she called the eye of the storm. So, right away, we're seeing tension between a self explanation, a parental explanation, and an outside critical reading. And this tension is what gives the whole topic its weight. Now, when we start thinking about demeanor, it's not just about what someone says, but how they look when they say it. Burke leaned forward, perched on his knees, talked with energy, and in some moments even seemed excited. That doesn't exactly match the story his parents gave about him being emotionally wrecked. Investigators like Fred Patterson and Dr. Suzanne Bernhard read his behavior as consistent and natural, which is why they cleared him. The media years later, however, spun those same traits as suspicious. What makes all of this fascinating is that the very same data point, a boy's demeanor, was read one way by law enforcement and another way by television producers. The phrase, "I'm just going on with my life," became a kind of litmus test. To some, it was resilience, to others, coldness. To investigators, it was a child doing his best. To media critics, it was a clue. That kind of split in interpretation shows us how fragile truth becomes when behavior is judged outside of context. So, with all of that laid out, we can now move into the analysis itself. Because when you break it down, we're not just dealing with what Burke said, but with how grief, personality, physiology, and forensic framing collided around one statement. That's where we can pull apart the contradictions, the logic, the psychological angles, and the criminological theories that make this such a complex topic. In a 1997 interview, Burke Ramsey described himself as just going on with my life. This statement, made 13 days after his sister JonBenet's murder during an interview with a psychologist, has been subject to various interpretations regarding his emotional state. Here are three major points to understand Burke's phrasing and how it might be interpreted. 1. Burke's getting on with life statement and its context. In a 1997 interview with a psychologist, Burke Ramsey was asked about how things had changed at his house, and he responded, "Well, police have it blocked off and stuff. My parents are sometimes crying, but I'm basically just going on with my life. This was noted in a later Dr. Phil interview, where Dr. Phil directly asked Burke about remembering saying this. In the Dr. Phil interview, Burke stated that he did not remember saying the phrase "getting on with life." Upon watching the video, he reflected, "I think I look like a normal kid. I think maybe that's just my personality, is that I'm a little like reserved." This suggests Burke perceived his demeanor as simply reflective of his natural personality. However, in the CBS documentary The Case of JonBenet Ramsey, pseudo expert Laura Richards characterized this as an odd turn of phrase to just go on with your life when your sister's been murdered and found in your house. She noted that while children are very resilient and they do get on with things, this particular time was right in the eye of the storm. Everything has just happened. This is life changing, this event, even for a 9-year-old boy. If we start with the phrase, "I'm just going on with my life," it feels unusually polished for a 9-year-old. Children often speak in fragments, with emotions spilling out unfiltered, but this line reads as composed, almost rehearsed. It raises the question, was Burke expressing something natural to him, or was he echoing adult language absorbed in a moment where raw emotion would have been expected? Children that age typically process disruption through confusion or longing. Their words mirror their struggle to make sense of what happened. Burke's response skips confusion entirely and lands on resolution, which is atypical. Psychologically, most children are stuck in "why did this happen?" rather than "how do I move forward?" That leap stands out. Context matters. The interviewer wasn't asking for a mission statement, but about his home and feelings. To pivot to "just going on" sounds like what forensic psychologists call a distancing mechanism, a way to keep emotions at arm's length. It's like a child convincing himself, if I don't look at the wound, it won't hurt. Some people naturally compartmentalize, boxing away pain to keep moving, but at 9 years old, such compartmentalization seems less instinctive and more deliberate. It creates a tension for investigators. Do they read that detachment as suspicious or as an unusual personality trait that doesn't align with typical developmental behavior? Timing and tone matter in forensic interpretation. Most children, when asked about a home filled with police, mention fear, sadness, or confusion. Burke skipped those entirely and anchored himself in continuity. That might look like maturity or emotional detachment. Both readings leave different marks in the forensic record. Children also anchor memories in sensory details, sounds, smells, disruptions to routines. Burke offered none of that. His words lack the sensory tether expected from a child's recollection, sounding instead like an abstract coping philosophy. It's as if the language belonged to someone older, framing survival rather than confusion. Physiologically, stress responses in children usually manifest as hyperarousal or shutdown, restlessness, chatter, withdrawal. Burke showed neither. Instead, his neutrality appeared practiced. From a neurobiological lens, it's an unexpected calm, suggesting either deep compartmentalization or an unusual ability to blunt the body's natural alarms. Language adds another layer. His phrasing is singular. I'm just going on with my life, with no "we," no inclusion of his family in that narrative. That can point to psychological isolation or self preservation. Later, when pressed by Dr. Phil, Burke doubled down, offering no warmth or reframing. That rigid consistency suggests a self concept untouched by outside critique or the passage of time. His brevity also functioned as a conversational wall. In interviews, children often offer an opening sentence that invites more exploration, but his didn't. It shut the door. Therapists and investigators see that pattern when subjects, consciously or not, want to control vulnerability by giving the bare minimum. Cultural scripts may play a role too. American individualism prizes independence even in children. I'm going on with my life fits that narrative, but in the context of family tragedy, it lands awkwardly, like a child wearing language too big for him. Years later, Burke still avoided sharing memories of JonBenet, leaving a void where stories and recollections might have lived. Finally, whether viewed through psychology, philosophy, or criminology, the phrase functions as a shield. If he was uninvolved, it was a child's way of surviving something unbearable. If he was involved, consciously or unconsciously, it could have been a pivot away from guilt. Either way, the language reveals more than words: a posture of detachment, a self concept insulated from intrusion, and a narrative built to endure pressure. 2. Interpretations of Burke's emotional state: resilience versus shock avoidance. The interpretation of Burke's seemingly detached phrasing falls into several categories, including genuine resilience, psychological shock or avoidance, and his inherent personality. From the perspective of the other side of suffering, John Ramsey, Burke's father, stated that Burke seemed unable to face JonBenet's death. It was just too difficult for him to process at the time. This suggests that Burke's emotional state was more a result of being overwhelmed and possibly in shock rather than a conscious display of callousness. In the Dr. Phil interview, Burke himself explained that at the time, he didn't really get it in terms of the full gravity of the situation. He also mentioned feeling a little awkward talking about it and believed that everyone knew what had happened, which might explain why he didn't elaborate further or ask more questions. The family's own state of profound grief and shock also provides important context. In a June 1998 interview, John Ramsey described himself and Patsy as totally devastated, crushed, ruined, mentally vegetables. Patsy Ramsey, in her April 1997 interview, noted that it was bedlam and she was a mess, leading them to believe it was best that he not be around. In The Other Side of Suffering, John Ramsey recounted his own struggle with numbness and heavy drinking after his eldest daughter Beth's death, highlighting that individual responses to grief can vary greatly and involve detachment from normal routines. The family was also under immense media scrutiny, and John Ramsey expressed a desire for his living children to not have to live under the legacy that our entertainment industry has given them based on false information and a frenzy created on our family's misery to achieve substantial profit. This focus on protecting Burke's future and reputation could have contributed to a reserved public demeanor. Burke's demeanor never fully matched the image of a withdrawn, traumatized child. Instead of shrinking into silence, he often appeared animated, leaning forward, talking quickly, and sometimes even showing excitement. This contrast challenges the idea that he couldn't handle what was happening. Children in shock often shut down, but Burke didn't. His behavior suggested arousal, his body staying alert and engaged, rather than emotional flatness. Psychologically, this looks less like avoidance and more like a nervous system still revved up in the aftermath of trauma. People later called him reserved, but the footage doesn't support that. He often moved closer during interviews, perched on his knees, showing curiosity. It paints a picture not of a child crushed into silence, but of one still eager to engage, even if his words suggested distance. This energy showed up again when interviewers asked if people were talking about him in the media. His response wasn't hesitant or sad, it was upbeat. That liveliness forces us to reconsider whether his going on with my lifeline was a mask or if at his core he hadn't changed at all. Some children are naturally high energy, and if that was Burke's baseline, then his behavior after the tragedy wasn't a transformation but continuity. That normalcy can unsettle observers expecting an obvious shift, but it also fits what investigators later noted. His engagement didn't seem rehearsed or forced. Still, his words and body language didn't align. Linguistically, he sounded detached, but physically, he radiated curiosity and restlessness. Psychologists call this incongruence a cognitive emotional mismatch when the mind tries to minimize pain while the body keeps broadcasting stress. Physiologically, stress arousal explains much of this. Children often respond to trauma with hyperactivity, adrenaline driving them to fidget, talk rapidly, or lean forward. Burke's energy fit that model, showing a body still on high alert, even as his words tried to sound neutral or detached. Investigators are trained to look for this kind of incongruence. While his words might have sounded distant, his open and energetic manner came across as authentic. That helped shape their eventual conclusion that he lacked knowledge of or direct involvement in what happened. This raises broader questions about how we interpret demeanor. Society expects grief to look quiet, subdued, and tearful, but Burke's behavior didn't fit that script. That mismatch doesn't necessarily signal guilt. It may simply expose how rigid our cultural expectations of grief can be. The forensic principle of baselining helps here. If Burke was naturally energetic, his post incident behavior wasn't unusual for him, only his phrasing was. That insight reframes his actions as authentic, even if they didn't match public assumptions about how a grieving child should look. Finally, when you combine all of this, His energy, his detachment in language, and his consistency over time, it doesn't point to guardedness or deception. Instead, it suggests a boy navigating stress through natural physiology and personality, his body alive with energy, while his words tried unsuccessfully to impose calm. 3. How investigators and others interpreted his demeanor. Initial law enforcement interviews with Burke Ramsey, conducted shortly after JonBenét's death, generally supported his innocence. In the Burke Ramsey versus CBS lawsuit, it is noted that Boulder Police Department Detective Fred Patterson interviewed Burke on December 26, 1996, and concluded that Burke did not have any idea or knowledge about what had happened to his sister. Similarly, Dr. Suzanne Bernhard, a psychologist who interviewed Burke on January 8, 1997, concluded in writing on her report to the Boulder PD that it was clear to her that Burke did not witness the murder of his sister. The lawsuit asserts that both the Boulder PD and Child Social Services were convinced from these interviews that Burke was unaware of the events and did not witness the murder. Furthermore, official statements from the Boulder District Attorney's Office, including those from DA Alex Hunter in 1999 and 2000 and DA Mary Lacey in 2008, publicly and unequivocally cleared Burke of suspicion. However, some pseudo-experts and media narratives, particularly those highlighted in the Burke Ramsey versus CBS lawsuit, interpreted Burke's demeanor differently. According to the lawsuit, Clemente and Richards, presented as experts in the CBS documentary, were totally unqualified to perform a psychological analysis of a child based on a video interview. Yet, they interpreted Burke's composure as suspicious, claiming his tone of it is completely off and that he showed no emotion, no appropriate emotion at all. They falsely implied that Burke's statement about feeling safe or just going on meant he knew he was the killer. The lawsuit alleges that these interpretations were part of a preconceived storyline to accuse Burke, ignoring exculpatory evidence and even admissions from their own source, James Kohler, that such behavioral observations were of a highly speculative nature and insufficient to prove involvement. They also falsely accused Burke of overselling his deep sleep and evading questions about pineapple found in JonBenét's system, suggesting he was consciously deceiving investigators. Early interviews never raised alarm for investigators. Detectives and child psychologists concluded Burke had no knowledge of what happened, noting his clarity, consistency, and lack of incriminating detail. To trained professionals, his behavior read as simple and authentic, not deceptive, something the media would later distort. The CBS lawsuit made this distortion clear. It argued that pseudo-experts spun demeanor into suspicion, prioritizing narrative over evidence. This highlights a core problem in criminology. Demeanor is subjective, while verifiable facts are concrete. When media fixate on how someone looks, they risk building stories untethered from reality. Courts have long cautioned against over-reliance on demeanor evidence because it is vulnerable to bias. Smiles can look like smirks, pauses can look like lies. In Burke's case, a 9-year-old's natural egocentrism, saying my life instead of our life, was treated as coldness, when in developmental terms it was simply youth. Grief isn't uniform either. John and Patsy portrayed Burke as overwhelmed, while investigators saw a child coping in his own way. That disconnect shows how different audiences receive different versions of the same boy, and how grief can be narrated to serve different purposes: protection in one setting, vulnerability in another. The lawsuit also underscored Burke's attempt to regain control of his narrative. Despite public suspicion, official investigators publicly cleared him, yet the stigma lingered. This reflects labeling theory in criminology. Once suspicion attaches, it's difficult to remove, no matter how much evidence exonerates. Physiology adds another layer. Children's nervous systems react on autopilot, energy, posture, tone, without conscious control. Burke's leaning forward or flat tone may have been involuntary stress responses, not indicators of guilt. Media projection, however, reframed these natural reactions as signs of something sinister. CBS's documentary bent his demeanor to fit its storyline of family involvement, ignoring forensic context. Demeanor alone cannot bear the weight of proof. Investigators relied on forensic reports, not posture or phrasing, yet the public clung to that single clip, going on with my life, looping it until it fossilized into a symbol of suspicion. Stripped of its 1997 context and replayed in 2016, the phrase became detached from time and meaning. Burke himself later called the interviews boring, a word that could reflect a coping mechanism rather than callousness. Investigators saw that neutrality as a shield. The media sold it as indifference. This created a kind of moral panic. People craved a coherent story, so they forced his demeanor into one. If he didn't look like a grieving brother, he must have been a suspicious sibling. Narrative, not evidence, drove perception, while investigators stuck to deductive reasoning rooted in facts, not speculation. Forensic psychologists also noted his baseline affect. Burke showed stability, not the erratic shifts often seen in deception or guilt. That steadiness reinforced the conclusion that he hadn't witnessed the event. Meanwhile, experts aligned with CBS blurred the line between speculation and science, prioritizing drama over discipline. Finally, from an investigative perspective, perpetrators rarely project such unrestrained energy or engagement. They blend in, restrain, and minimize. Burke's natural liveliness did the opposite, reinforcing why professionals lean toward innocence even as media narratives fed public suspicion. Demeanor, in the end, became both everything and nothing, powerful in perception, but meaningless against hard evidence. As we move into the discussion, it's important to take a step back and revisit some of the details we've analyzed so far. Burke's phrasing, his demeanor, and the ways others, both investigators and the media, interpreted his behavior have surfaced repeatedly. This section will dig deeper into those threads, not to draw final conclusions, but to examine how these elements intersect and what they reveal when placed side by side. Burke's phrase, "I'm just going on with my life," wasn't just notable for its wording, but for its timing, spoken only 13 days after JonBenet's death. Psychologists might call it a distancing phrase, language that closes emotional doors. Whether intentional or not, it sounded mechanical, leaving many to question if it reflected genuine coping or a borrowed line of adult logic. Footage of Burke complicates the picture further. His parents described him as fragile and unable to cope, but the tapes show an alert, animated boy leaning forward and engaging. This behavior doesn't match a child in emotional collapse. Instead, it suggests either a natural tendency toward high energy. Developmental theory adds another layer. At 9, children typically describe their world concretely, what they see, feel, or hear. Burke's statement, abstract and almost philosophical, doesn't fit that pattern. It raises the possibility that his words were less about his true inner state and more about repeating adult language meant to convey resilience. Investigators, however, saw no deception in his behavior. His answers were simple and consistent, qualities that in forensic interviews often align with innocence. Yet the media flipped that reading, magnifying his detached phrasing into a narrative of suspicion. This is where criminological philosophy warns us. Demeanor evidence is unreliable, easily warped by bias and repetition. The looping of that single clip, "going on with my life," turned it into a symbol, a shorthand for every judgment people wanted to make about Burke. Public perception calcified into suspicion, even as district attorneys publicly cleared him. It's a textbook example of labeling theory. Once suspicion attaches, it lingers regardless of evidence. Burke himself, years later, never reinterpreted his words. On Dr. Phil, he insisted the phrase simply reflected his personality, offering no new nuance. Adults typically reshape childhood memories with age, but Burke didn't. That rigidity suggests a self-concept locked in place, unmoved by decades of scrutiny and speculation. At the same time, the contrast between his phrasing and his energy leaves us with a dual picture. A boy using language as a shield, while his body revealed stress, curiosity, and even restlessness. It's a dynamic often seen in trauma, where the mind tries to impose order even as the body keeps processing chaos. That duality makes any simple explanation incomplete. Another point worth considering is the cultural script at play. American ideals of independence and resilience often seep into family language, especially in moments of crisis. Burke's comment, while jarring to some, also fits that cultural frame. Life goes on. It may have been adult logic filtered through a child's vocabulary, but that doesn't make it unnatural in its setting. The lawsuit against CBS became, in that light, an attempt not just to claim damages, but to reclaim narrative control. For Burke, this was about reshaping public interpretation, asserting that what people had labeled suspicious was in reality a child's way of surviving and continuing. Whether that reframing succeeded or not, it underscores how deeply interpretation, rather than fact, shaped his public identity. Ultimately, this discussion highlights how meaning is constructed. One phrase, one clip, and one demeanor were magnified into a permanent symbol of suspicion. But when we pull back and examine context, development, and physiology, a more complex picture emerges, one that resists the simplicity of either total innocence or hidden guilt, and forces us to sit with the ambiguity that real human behavior often holds. Bringing it all together, Burke's simple phrase, "going on with my life," became something far larger than itself. Investigators, parents, psychologists, and the media each viewed it through their own lens, creating a fractured mirror of interpretations. What investigators saw as normal coping, the public turned into something suspicious, magnified by documentaries, lawsuits, and endless replays. Maybe it was just a child echoing adult logic, or a boy whose natural energy clashed with outsiders' expectations of grief. Maybe his parents overstated his fragility to protect him, while the footage showed a child still in motion, still himself. Those contradictions are what keep the fascination alive, exposing the gap between evidence-based conclusions and narrative-driven judgment. More than anything, this case shows the danger of over-interpreting demeanor. Smiles, tones, and casual phrases are slippery things, easily shaped into whatever story someone wants to tell. Burke's coping became a symbol, but symbols are not facts, and in the end, what they reveal may say as much about our collective need for answers as they do about Burke himself. And I'll stop it right there, but I want to say thanks for your love and support. Hope you're doing well. Don't forget to like and share and subscribe. And until the next time, take it easy.